Everybody, we move into the post-tea break session. It's a session which the tone for the session I thought was nicely set by the Vachana Sahitya, which address things like caste and differentiations and oral histories and histories of people who have no histories. So I think it's apt that we have with us Professor Gopal, who is at the Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, JNU. He particularly specializes in social and moral theory, socio-political thought in modern India, social movements. He has edited a book on humiliation called Humiliation, Claims and Context, and Atrophy in Dalit Politics. He's also written the book Cracked Mirror, Indian Debate on Theory and Experience, with Sundar Sarukkai. I'm stressing the second part because everyone keeps calling it the cracked mirror. It's just not the cracked mirror. It's a cracked mirror which is a debate on theory and experience. And I think the second part of the book is more important than the first part. He's on the editorial board of several research journals like Social Change, Studies in Indian Politics, Lokniti Journal and African Review. He's also received several fellowships and is a member of several academic bodies. Malcolm Adisheshaya Award for the year 2013, etc. have been some of the awards that have been given to him. He's also adjunct professor, Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities, and we're very fond of him when he comes over here. So without further ado, Professor Gopal, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Meera, for your. Yeah, I got it. Correct. Thank you, Meera, for your introduction and nice words that you spoke about me. I like that last introduction of mine as adjunct professor at MCPH, Manipal University. I also take this opportunity to thank Gayatri and Nikhil for inviting me to be in dialogue with Professor Romila Thapar. We keep listening to her through YouTube, directly through books, but this is a rare opportunity that I am in face-to-face with her today. So I'll just take about 20 minutes so that we have enough time for Professor Thapar and others to make comments. I'm going to be in conversation with her on this particular book, DREN, Recasting Constructs. It's a very, very suggestive title. And this is published by 3 essays in 2008. There are about 5 chapters, and those chapters were written from time to time during the last 40 years. And these are very important chapters. Out of the 5 chapters, I might focus only on the first 3 because they're so important as far as I can see them. Why they are important, why the whole book is so important. I have got 6 justifications to say why this book is so important. Why is the work important? That's the question I ask. Not only it has acquired a majestic status in the discursive field of history, but because it holds us and helps us to interrogate ill-founded assumptions of certain political forces in contemporary times, also helps us to relook at some of our own theoretical historical understanding more carefully and more closely. And therefore it is so important. This book, I mean, every page has very, very important insights. So it's very difficult to summarize the book. I'm just putting that book, the whole discussion into some formulations later. So this is the first thing as to why it is so important for us to discuss this book today. Second, it helps us to question the cultural practices of those social sections who are longing for becoming Aryan for a very long time. Certain members of the groups who consider themselves to be culturally deprived, such as OBCs and Dalit. OBCs, the earlier Shudra caste. These groups have developed an acute desire to pack themselves into the category called Aryan. Thanks to this TV series like Ramayana and Mahabharata. And if you, Professor Thapar, if you look at the names that OBC parents are given to their children, Aryan and this and that, and they're all culturally different earlier. So this is a new trend. In Mumbai, you find this kind of Sanskritization, if you want to use that term. So this is second. That's why this book is actually interrogating the whole cultural aspiration of this. Why should they really adopt? Is it a kind of a empty signifier they are looking for? Or does it have any meaningful normative content in it? Do they really adopt these names self-reflectively or without reflection? And if that is without reflection, what is the political fallout of this whole thing? Adoption to this. I'm really worried about this. And this is slow but definite process happening among these groups. Therefore, I don't know whether they will read this book, but they should read this book on priority. Second. Third, Professor Thapar's work is also important to understand the limits of internationalization of caste that certain Dalits are seeking through the mediation of race. And through this mediation, they are collapsing race into caste. And this collapse of race into caste is also an opposition to Aryan race. And I must really share with you this Dharma conference, and certain NGOs, Dalit NGOs are trying to internationalize their cause, social cause, not through caste, but collapsing caste into race against the category, which is active category, Aryan race. Therefore this book, and you are raising important points, and I'm your follower in this. There was a big debate, I think. Government of India is taking some different stance on it. We're not discussing that here at the moment. We're just discussing it academically. As to why certain people should take this book so seriously for their own self-understanding, if not doing immediate politics of survival and cultural signification. That's the limited desire that I have, and expectation that I have about them. This is the third justification as to why one should really read, and read openly, read collectively this book. 3 chapters, the 3 chapters are so absolutely important for detoxifying oneself, all this Aryanism. This is the third. And this is my own emphasis, you may not agree with me. Fourth, this work of hers is so important because it gives us an opportunity to evaluate attempts made by certain Dalit Bahujan organizations. And my major question is the hyphen between Dalit and the Bahujan. Dalit Bahujan organization to define their authenticity, or to put it to really forego their indigenousness by constructing Aryans as the invading others. And this has reference to Phule, and you are stating his position so clearly, but desiring with him, and I also join you desiring with you about Phule. So the whole, this organization called BAMSEC and others are trying, and the DNA is so prominent in the, you must really have a DNA test so that we have a common legacy, common origin. DNA is the other side as well. So invading other is the common, and that goes very close to Phule. Of course, they take their cue from Jyotirao Phule to really gain some kind of very problematic historical understanding. You have spelled it JYO. I don't know whether you mentioned it or the publisher mentioned it, but JYO is Jyotiba. JYO is a Sanskrit word. Joti, Jyoti. Jyoti is the non-Brahmin Kunbi word. That
I got it from a translation of Gurangiri.
that is G.P. Deshpande.
Yeah.
The mistake is in the original. Anyway, forget about it. So this is the fourth thing that we have to ask them to read this book before they really go for this project of indigenizing, and therefore the moment you indigenize, you have to construct the other. And other is a very problematic thing, is it? It is not simply Aryan. Others, Mlechas and Yavanas become other. So should we really do that? And what implication does it have for secularism that we talk about? Can you really construct this category as a very problematic category? And is it theoretically sound and politically correct? Take a call on this. That's why this book is so important. It's raising really very sharp questions about this. Fifth, it also helps us to critically arrive at the normative judgment and enables us to associate with thinkers. This is reference to what Raghu was saying in the morning. It helps us to critically arrive at the normative judgment that will enable us to associate us with thinkers who are making tradition critical against Brahmanism. And you are thinking, and I have been listening to you reading, no historian in this, I have not seen, except even others, are really talking about Brahmanism. It is a taboo. And therefore yours is a different analysis of you are talking about that tradition which other thinkers are making critical. For example, in your last Nikhil Chakravarti memorial lecture, and I had the chance to listen to you through the YouTube. You are making this point, you are actually associating yourself with the tradition which is non-Brahmin, but and critical of Brahmanism, which you say the Periyar, Phule, and the Tanjavur person whose name I keep forgetting, Sarfoji. And so that is one critical. So what is the set of thinkers with whom you want to associate? Thinkers who are seeking transgression of tradition, not staying in the tradition, but transgression of tradition. Thus is the shifting boundaries and transforming boundaries, or maybe annihilating boundaries. As against the thinkers who want to make traditions critical, but for the extension of the tradition itself. So are you really therefore, and that's the issue I would like to have with Raghu. I mean, in a way, if it is Vivekananda, and you're mentioning 3-4 Dayananda Saraswati Nadas in the nationalist context, Aurobindo, Vivekananda, Dayananda Saraswati, and even Gandhi. You don't mention Gandhi, you mention only 3-4 of them. Gandhi makes tradition critical. For what? To subvert it or extend it? And that's the question. And you are raising the same question differently. And it has come up in the morning session as well. So is there a complete departure from our own original station, our location? And so I think all these thinkers are actually using their affinity, they're expressing their affinity with Aryan during the freedom struggle. But you also make that point, and I'm just quickly submitting into consideration that for some reason Aryan as a category was never fascinating in the national discourse. Very important point. So this is the fifth justification I would like to reaffirm here. Now the last one. And this has relationship to my personal intellectual upbringing, my own trajectory, intellectual within quotes. From her work, particularly on social history of Buddhism's early Orient Longman publication, that's the only book that has really lasting impact on me, by the way. And then your 2 volumes, The History of India, Ashoka, Penguin. Those early works, so those were the days I was really reading them very closely. Not for IAS. No. Yes. When I was a student everybody was reading those things because we wanted to discuss issues of Buddhism. From her work, particularly on social history of Buddhism, early work published by Orient Longman, History of India, and 2 volumes, what I have personally learned from these 3 volumes is that history is also a pedagogical exercise. History as pedagogy. Actually, I have written something, I just want to really impress upon you. I have written something on history as pedagogy, and I have not published it so far. Let me explain history as pedagogy by citing my own encounter with her work. But encounter is a very soft word. Buddhism. Before I read her work, I read Ambedkar very carefully and thought that since Ambedkar gave me the most refined version of Buddhism in Neo-Buddhism, I thought there was no reason to look at Buddhism more critically. And I'm suggesting that I hadn't read Ambedkar carefully then. Thus, for me, reason became a faith in Ambedkar's Neo-Buddhism. But after I read Professor Thapar's book, I developed the need to intensify my critical gaze at Buddhism, which has roots in Ambedkar. Looking at Buddhism critically has roots in Ambedkar. Therefore, I'm not shifting away from, I'm not changing my party, I'm with both of you in a way. Both Ambedkar and you. Now, this is the book I'm going to discuss. This is the second part of my presentation. Do we have about some minutes? As he has, and I'm just repeating something you already mentioned, that what is, out of the 4, that is the problem. Out of the 4 and 5 you are listing, the methodology of looking at history. One is, of course, archaeology, which you mentioned, and it is required to really understand the complex term like Aryan. Then the other one is historiography, of course, intellectual field of really giving a full final treatment to concepts, that is how we look at historiography. And that's why it's not simply facts and figures and collection of that, it is a different exercise altogether. But people have a very easy notion of historiography, and that we learn from the treatment you have given, and the discussion that took place in this time question was very suggestive of that. Then the other one is social anthropology. You're suggesting that as well, very important. I don't know how I've been finding it so difficult to make common cause with the historians. I had a big fight with them not because you are extending the boundaries of history so as to really have a very meaningful dialogue with social sciences. But some of the historians, for good reasons I guess, develop some kind of individual consciousness of history. Individualizing history into that reified consciousness is really disenabling. You must open up that. And therefore this 4, and the linguistic the methods of language is so important to understand Aryan, and you are actually focusing more on that, and that really this method of really approaching Aryan through linguistic method is solving so many problems for us. So this is now the debatable point. She has already mentioned in the morning that the concept of Aryan is so complex, and you cannot really offer a very conclusive understanding of this concept. It is all the time making it difficult for us to really offer a very conclusive understanding of the concept of Aryan. But she has given us very, very enabling picture of how to really locate the trajectory, the conceptual trajectory of the Aryan. That is in the second essay in this book, the theory of race, Aryan race. So you are arguing, and I'm taking only the languages. You are arguing that Aryan is not something which has come from outside, and there are certain minor scale migrations of people who were speaking some kind of Indo-Aryan language, and therefore it is not wholesale migration of language that has come from Afghanistan and that place. You are making another important point. Once the language comes, you say that the spread of language does not have to be linked with overwhelming number of people. And this is a very important point as far as I can see. In the context of Sanskrit being imposed as the language of homogenization today, there are several languages, 28, 29, many languages are there. But that is a very rhetorical point. And we are not at the moment interested in rhetorical point. What we are interested in is that the genealogy of this language, the concept, the concept of Aryan. And language, if it is a language category, as you say, and I agree with you, and I don't require my agreement anyway. So language is not, and I'm just putting in my own words, language is not the function of number, and vice versa. I mean, you don't require many people to follow language. It can exist on its own strength. But why are people really insisting that people should really speak one kind of language? That's the fantastic, very enabling, powerful insight we get from people. You have to decode it, popularize it. And so I thought that was, so therefore they came with mind and the language, but then it became Aryan is not physical entity. Aryan is not also a strictly geographical entity. It is a label of language. And label of language. Just as people speaking Aryan are people, and they are called Aryan. They get some personal status, and there is no physical characterization that you achieve through this language. Just as we have Dravidian is a label, language label. So you are in a way actually insulating this whole question of Aryan from being politicized. You are actually locating it so accurately in terms of its own evolution through linguistic transformation, linguistic tech. So, so this is an important point I thought you are making in your, and therefore your Munda. Munda, of course, is a very important point, And they say the Jakudali Munda in it, there's a different connotation Munda in Punjabi language. So these are all so these are very important. The Dravidian, Munda, and Aryan, these are all labels, and that we have to really treat them as labels. and they are not physical. They are not physical characterization of any person. Important third point. I'm just summarizing. She argues, and we must keep that in mind, particularly the young scholars. I'm also young. She argues no permanent socio-economic rituals and language between Aryan and Dasas. There was no permanent language. Language as a category, and Aryan as a category was always evolving, leading to identities. And identities are changing all the time. Therefore, it will be unfair to put her into some box, some kind of a Marxist scholar who is unavailable for any kind of negotiation. No, she is not taking, she is actually making this point. Look here, I am not making a claim to make definitive judgments. That's how you start with. I am not making any claim to make definitive judgments and conclusions. I am actually making field, I am rendering field open for free inquiry. And this is what we were discussing, Devika, yesterday, somewhere, about, you have been discussed since yesterday. So that's that's, I think, important point. That you are actually following certain decent academic methodological protocols. I don't know why people really, the moment you speak, people have some image of you. But you have become an idea, you are not image.
Very much.
I'm sure that's it. So this is, and then in another second section, and in the first section you also separate caste from race and other things. This is also very important. Race and caste are separate. Second, in the second essay, the damage is done by the comparative philology scholars, and Max Muller is leading them, collapsing everything into race and caste and Aryan, branding Raman Rai as Aryan. He mentioned everything there. And so, therefore, whole thesis of separation and elevated discussion becomes issues of setback. But during the colonial period, as you very rightly said, in the nationalist struggle, Aryan as a category did not really interest people. It was not important for them to use Aryan as a category, just except Dayanand Saraswati's Arya Samaj and other people, but it was not the mobilizing category. But you have Tilak and Jyotirao Phule, who is sharing the same discursive ground, saying that in a way the Phule is, of course, and you write very copiously on both the figures. Tilak is considering Aryans as outsiders, Arctic Homo Aryans, Central Asia. And the missionaries, you also quote the missionary sources. And Jyotirao Phule is the Iranian Brahmins, and they have come from there. But I just wanted to also know from you, this, I was told, I don't know, I'm looking for the evidence, but you will help me in this. This Geneva, from where did you get this holy belt? Holy belt is Max Weber's term. Holy belt. From where did we get it? Was it Indian origin or something? Did we ever have a tradition of growing cotton in this country so that we could really make holy belts? And I was told that it has come from Iran. I know, I just want to find out. But then Jyotirao said they are from outside, and you given some very insightful account of that. And they were Aryan speaking, Sanskrit speaking people, Aryans, and therefore we heard, and then there is opposition. and there is an emphasis on indigenousness and all that, and you definitely disagree with them, with both basically Jyoti Rao, and I also disagree with him. I disagree with him from the point of view of Ambedkar, and that's the question I'm raising in my response to your book. So I would like to summarize this book. I have just made some points which are so important today. There are several points, insights, but I am just trying to now summarize 3 chapters in following manner. Please forgive me, and if I'm sounding to be so unintelligible. Aryans are historically constituted. I'm just summarizing this. They are socio-culturally produced and reproduced, and linguistically familiarized and communicated, and of course politically articulated and asserted. And you see that assertion today. And therefore we have to go. You have to therefore really disabuse the term Aryan through conceptual theoretical force and thrust. Now I am already suggesting that all those people who are affected by Aryan should take this book seriously. Now, Meera, can I just you have got the questions, you know?
Yeah.
But I have my own. I'm just raising 2 points. One point is, should I start with this? That you put the hyphen between Dalit and Bahujan. But the hyphen is tenable. But I think this the small hyphen, not the extendable hyphen. That is my reading. Just because Aryans are now, the OBs are becoming more Aryanized. While it is historically true that the politics of solidarity did introduce the hyphen between these 2 words, the Dalit and the Bahujan, yet this hyphen cannot be stretched too far for historical reasons. What I argue is that there is both ontological as well as epistemological limit that has been imposed by the changing configuration of social power. And Ambedkar's critique of Bahujan is so prominent, and that we don't discuss because we will not be politically correct. But in the event of this whole thing, OBC's whole political makeup and their own consciousness, we have to raise this point. I mean, without any favor and fear. In the light of this claim, we find some ground on which we can engage with Professor Thapar, at least on the following issues. 1. There is a differential reading of concept of Aryan within the Dalit Bahujan discourse. And this reading seeks deviation from the reading of Phule. Ambedkar is actually not buying into Phule. There is an internal critique. And when we were talking about critique in the earlier in the Swarajin ideas thing also, and even in Raghu's thing, so what is tradition? And I thought, there are two books particularly dealing with history. One is History as Philosophy, Philosophy and History by Richard Rorty and Quinton Skinner's fact volume, where you dealt with philosophy and history so seriously. And that one and the Quinton Skinner's book. What is tradition? Tradition is tradition which is internally flowing and critical. It doesn't foreclose, it is flowing. So Ambedkar belongs to that tradition of association starting from Buddha, Kabir down to Phule, but disagreeing with everybody. Neo Buddhism. And he doesn't agree with Phule that look here, Aryans haven't come from outside. And they agree with you and Didi Goswami, by the way. They haven't come from outside. And there is no relationship between color, flesh, and your caste, they're different. They're different things. And therefore, Ambedkar is making this point, quoting on some British sources, anthropologists, census commissioners, social anthropologists, and saying that there is a difference between race and caste. You can't collapse. But this is not the question for you and me, but it is for those people who are internationalizing caste. Don't package Ambedkar the way you want to package him. He's asking question to Phule, and therefore those who are looking for indigenous thing, roots, should also read Ambedkar. But these people don't read Ambedkar. They read selectively Phule, because Phule helps them to really confirm their political agenda, support their political agenda. So this is one, I thought there's some discussion on Ambedkar, which I would like you to, next, I would just request you to do something on Ambedkar next time when you speak. To put it straightforward manner, Ambedkar radically disagreed with Phule in understanding Aryan. But he is using the language that you are using, Indo-Aryans, Aryan society, Indo-Aryan society, and all that he is using. And he's saying that there's a non-linear understanding. But Aryan, Dasas were also Aryans. You also make that point. There's a discrepancy.
Not quite.
Not quite? Okay, good. So, misreading. Second, interestingly, there is a remarkable closeness between, and so this is the point I'm not repeating. So this, one can read therefore Romila Thapar, D.D. Kosambi and Ambedkar together, excluding Phule. And therefore you can also develop the criticals O. Handlen, G.P. Deshpande and Gila Ahmed, because they are giving us some kind of a cultural, only cultural understanding, cultural interpretation of the whole trajectory of Aryan. And the notion of Bali Raja that you bring in, just to, that is also very, very fascinating. Bali Raja is the legendary figure in the vocabulary of Phule, anti-Brahmin movement. Bali Raja is a Daitya, and who's through the cunning of this Vamana, who is the incarnation of Vishnu, is sending him into the Patala. So that memory, and you're talking about memory is in favor of Bali Raja. On the first day of Diwali, everywhere in, I think, northern Karnataka and full of Maharashtra, you say, the women particularly say, Ida jao, pida jao, and Bali che rajayo. All our suffering should go away, and let us really invite, let us welcome, let us summon Bali's Raja. And all that is the part of Bali Raja, the most progressive, Bali Raja, the poor peasant Raja, Bali Raja, the most democratic Raja, and against the grain. So that is that discussion is covered in your book. That's it. I have only 2 points. So I should stop here, and don't ask me questions. You can ask questions to Professor Romila Thapar. Thank you very much. I sit there. Okay.
Just so that if you want to interject, you are welcome to interject. Interjections. So while Professor Thapar takes the stage, I have a small anecdotal example model for all of you. When we used to play games, the ball sometimes used to just circulate between 2 main players, and the rest of us used to just stand and stare at the ball. So in the question answer session, I request that this become an open platform where people are not just having one-on-one conversation and the questions. I welcome you to clarify your questions and add depth to the questions, but I would rather that the debate opens up to the larger, there's lots of time till 4:25, 4:30. So I would request you to keep your questions brief, but also engage and welcome the other people also to participate equally and not just keep passing question answer. Thank you. Maybe have a show of hands. We'll have Thapar respond to this.
Yes, I was, to begin with, very interested in your juxtaposing Ambedkar with Phule, because they are different. And of course, my interest in the difference was because historically, I was seeing Phule as the counterweight to Tilak, and Ambedkar much later. And I had the feeling that Phule is writing very deliberately, examining the question from a distinctly different point of view, socially, than Tilak. Tilak is the normal Maharashtrian Brahmin, and he's reflecting those views. Even this whole absurdity of the Aryans originated in the Arctic homeland and came trekking all the way down into India from the Arctic homeland, to which I don't know whether you're familiar with this. When he was questioned about this and said how could they in those days have trekked all the way from the Arctic down to India, he said no, it was possible. And then there was someone called R.C. Das in Bengal who wrote an entire book to prove that the Arctic homeland was located in Bihar. So the trek was possible. No, I mean, you know, sometimes you come across this kind of information and you think, what are the extents to which people went to make historical positions? But there it was. Anyway, so I think that Phule has to be seen very much in terms of he's the man who's contesting Tilak. And that contestation is extremely interesting. I mean, I don't go into it because I'm only concerned with the whole business of how they saw the Aryans. But Phule does talk about the Brahmins. The Aryans are Brahmins who came in and oppressed the Kshatriyas and the lower castes. Ambedkar's position is much stronger, where he talks about dominant castes and subordinate castes. You know, the Aryan element is perhaps not so central as the fact that you have in the caste system a hierarchy of the dominant caste and the subordinate caste, which is extremely important. Now, again, there is an ambivalence. Tilak doesn't say it's invasion, he says it's a migration from outside. Whereas Phule, of course, projects it very much as an invasion and therefore the oppression of the existing people. The Brahmins were superior and they came and conquered. Slightly with the image, I think, of colonialism. Perhaps the unconscious image of the devastation and the oppression that conquerors can establish. Because, I mean, you know, one reads a lot of history books about invasions and conquests, and yet you never really get the feel of how devastating it is. But if you're actually living in a situation where you've been conquered and you're living in that situation, then it becomes a much more intense experience. The Shudras, of course, consist of diverse groups. It's interesting that in Phule, it's everybody from the Kshatriyas down. It's not just the OBCs and the Dalits, but it's everybody who's non-Brahmin. It's essentially Brahmin, non-Brahmin at one level. And I think that makes a very interesting difference. The Shudras are diverse groups unified by the one main thing, which is the disabilities of the normative code, the Manu's code. The disabilities that they all have to suffer is an aspect of the unification of what we would today call OBCs and Dalits. One of the things that interested me, not when I was writing then, but when I was reading your questions and when I was thinking about it, is that today I think we really have to go into this question much more as to why Dalits want to become Aryans. You know, it's been brushed over by saying, well, obviously it's the upper caste image, it's the upper caste culture, they're against caste, they want to declare their hostility. But they want to declare their hostility to that culture, and yet they want to be a part of that culture. Now, this I find extremely intriguing, that you object to Manu's code, and yet you want to be a part of the society that Manu is talking about. Because Manu is very strong on this business of being an Arya and all the rest of it and what it entails. And I began to wonder that why is it that some Dalit historian hasn't thought up a new idea, which is not exactly new. It has been touched on by historians, a couple of historians, but which I've discussed, I think, in the 4th lecture.
No,
Yeah.
I didn't go there.
Oh, you didn't get there. All right, never mind. It's at the moment a very marginal idea, but I think it has great potential. So please don't quote me on this, but let me mention it to you. Why has it not, if one accepts, which of course the Phule tradition doesn't, but Ambedkar does, that there was a migration of Aryan speakers, not an invasion. And by migration, I mean, when I talk about migration, I mean what we as children used to call, in English I think it's called leapfrogging migration. One person bends down and the other person comes and they put their hands on the back of the person who's bent down and they leap over and they get there. And then they stand there and someone else comes along and they bend down and they leap over and they get there. Now, that kind of migration means small communities that come in and settle down amongst a variety of other people. Something of a common culture begins to emerge, and then somebody from that community A leapfrogs out and creates community B in another area. And then another little culture develops, and then community B leapfrogs out and goes and creates community C. Now, in that sort of situation, if that is what the migration is about, then the question of how did the language spread, which for me is a very important question and which Professor Gopal Guru also referred to, becomes a very central issue. It's not the invasion or, how did they come and so on, but the spread of the language and the culture becomes very important, because within that spread is the whole question of what is the society that is being created. Then perhaps one begins to see that what many people have called Vedic Brahmanism, the particular Brahmanism of the Vedic texts of the Vedic times, is a society on the defensive. And I think that this is perhaps an idea that needs to be investigated. I have not done it, but I think it's something that needs to be investigated. To what extent was there a feeling that somehow the values that they had brought in with them as migrants and which had got mixed and merged and so on, were values that were not being accepted fully and completely by everybody, and therefore there's a sort of distancing and a feeling that, this is us, this is we, this is our culture, that's their culture. The reason why I say this is that there is, in fact, a fairly strong discrimination in the Rig Veda, which is the earliest of the texts, and probably dating around at least the 13th and 12th century BC. There's a very strong feeling of Arya Varna and Dasa Varna. This is much before the 4 Varnas. Who are the Arya Varna and who are the Dasa Varna? The Dasa Varna in particular. They are people who do not speak our language. They're people who don't worship our gods, they don't observe our rituals, their custom is different. there's a controversy about whether they looked different. Is it a nasa? Is it a naasa? Which makes a difference between not having a nose, not having an orifice, a mouth. If it's not having a nose, then you're down to flat-nosed people who are physically distinctive. If you don't have a mouth, you're virtually saying they don't speak our language. That is a mythological way of mentioning it, perhaps. Anyway, that is a little doubtful, but otherwise it's very much a case of us and them. The Dasas live in forts, they have a lot of cattle. We don't know whether it's forts or whether they live in stockaded enclosures, and they have a lot of cattle wealth. They're very wealthy. And there's a tremendous envy. We have to go out and raid their cattle and bring it back. And it's true that there's no mention of invasion, but there's a lot of mention of these cattle raids and skirmishes, which is, of course, as we know from medieval hero stones, cattle raids are a given feature of Indian history from the beginning right up to medieval times. But what is interesting, this has been noticed and passed by many historians, but was pointed out by Didi Kosambi in a slightly more pertinent manner. There are references to perhaps some dasas getting integrated, and getting integrated at a level of society where you wouldn't think they would be integrated so easily. Didi Kosambi refers to this curious phrase in the later Vedic texts, the Brahmanas, Dasi Putraha Brahman. Does this mean a Brahman who is the son of a slave woman? Or does it mean a Brahman who is the son of someone who belongs to the Dasa community? I think this is an interesting difference that needs to be worked out, and nobody's really tackled it. So that leads to the very interesting question that if at the level of the Brahmins, you could have a mixed category of this kind, and not even mixed, they're pure, they're Dasi Putraha, except that some of the illustrations that are given later on of people like Virghatama, who marries a Dasi, Ushija, and produces a son, a very, very famous rishi who plays an extremely important part in the Vedic texts, Kakshivan, and who is always talked about as being a very revered rishi from the past, patronized by Indra. Now, you know, that really is high qualification altogether in Vedic terms. Why is he called a Dasi Putraha Brahman? This is something that has to be explained. It can be one of two things. It can be that there were, and then there is the other one, also very, very revered, Kavash Ailusha, again described as a Dasi Putraha Brahman. What does it mean? Either that there were some Brahmins who were from the Dasa community who were brought into the Brahman fold and became Brahmins, or through birth, through the slave women who worked, the Dasis who worked in homes of the Aryas. And we know that this was the case because in the Rig Veda, again, you have what are called the Dhanastuti hymns, where the poet is praising the chief who has gone out and conducted a cattle raid. And when he comes back, the poet writes a poem in praise of the chief. He was great, he did wonderful things, he did this, he destroyed so-and-so, he killed so-and-so, and so forth. And he has given me a very generous present, consisting of 10,000 head of horse, 60,000 head of cattle, this, and 50 dasis. So, our dasis now chattel an item of wealth. So it's a little ambiguous as to what the word Dasi means in this context. It could be either of the two. But what is interesting is, of course, the stories that are associated with them. In the one case, the Brahmins are looking down upon the Dasi Putra Brahmins as being inferior. But when they start the ritual, when the yajna starts, the Saraswati river comes and touches the feet of the Dasi Putra Brahman. So immediately the other Brahmins say, oh, these guys are really absolutely top class, and they induct them into their fold and make them into regular Brahmins. Now, the fact that this is happening, even though it's not mentioned too frequently, but there are these very famous figures of rishis who are associated with this, also leads to the other possibility, which one or two people have discussed in passing, that was the Dasa population that survived with the coming in of the migrant Aryans, perhaps the remnants of the late Harappans. Not the actual Harappans, because the Harappan cities declined around 1700, and the Rig Veda doesn't really get to be written till about 1300. There's 500 years in between. There's 500 years where you may have had some settlements with some ritual specialists and much mythology. And this is where the issue of what we were discussing this morning, collective memory. Mythology, after all, is collective memory of some kind, much worked upon, changed, different contours from time to time, but there might somewhere be a hint of something that goes back to earlier times. So do we then have to think of the possibility that some of the mythology, at least, in the Rig Veda and possibly in the later Vedic texts as well, could have gone back to Harappan times? Just some elements of it. I mean, the reason why I haven't discussed this in any of my books is because it needs a tremendous amount of research before anything on this lines can be said with any kind of categorical insistence that it might have been so. A tremendous amount of research, and one doesn't want to float half-baked ideas which then get hit upon, and then one gets described in all kinds of abusive terms. But this is just one possibility, and this possibility becomes feasible if you think of this period, as I was saying this morning, and as Professor Gopal Guru also mentioned just now, as being a period in which you use language, linguistics, archaeology, historiography, genetics, and social anthropology. How do people speaking another language, when they arrive as pastoral migrants in the midst of a settled community, what is the way in which they interact with each other? This has been discussed by social anthropologists, and we have to turn to those discussions to ask questions, not to find answers, to ask questions about how the situation might have been in the Indian context. So that is, in fact, an important. Now, yes, what started me off on this was that would it not be more politically purposeful if the Dalits were to say, we are those Dasas, and we have an inheritance from possibly the Indus civilization, which some have said. This is not a completely alien idea. There are some people who have said that the original inhabitants that Phule talks about are precisely the Dasas and probably now the Harappans. That has been said. But I'm saying this more in the sense of, if there were Dasi Putra Brahmins, then who were they? Were they Dasas? And if they were Dasas and they were local people of low caste, then the Brahman Varna is a combination of what came from outside and what was locally available. This puts a very, very different aspect onto the whole discussion.
Exclusive as well. Exclusive as well.
Very explosive, yes. But I mean, which is why I've kept silent on it. And I would, if someone said, either are these your ideas, I would say, no, they're not my ideas. So please, nobody quote me on this. I have enough to contend with. But I would have thought that this would be politically much more forceful than saying we all want to be Aryas.
Yes.
And I'm just intrigued that, this, it has been hinted at by various people, but somehow it was not taken up. And what is the great attraction of insisting that you were also Aryas when in fact you would insist on something much more dramatic than that? But anyway, that's one thing. Yeah, the Dalit hyphen Bahujan. I think this is a historically placed hyphen. That is that originally in the texts, the separation between the non-Dalits and the Dalits is very sharp, very distinctive, and there's no way in which there can be any kind of bridge between the two. I mean, the Dalits are outside the caste system, leave alone being anything else. They're simply outside. They don't matter at all. And then you get the coming in of the lower castes, the OBCs, beginning to play a role, beginning to assert a certain existence, and then it becomes convenient to hyphenate it and talk about Dalit Bahujans because you get a larger body of people coming in. So I think that is a historical thing. Baliraj, yes, it is absolutely fascinating, the whole myth of Baliraj, because it is a myth that converts. It's the inversion, not just that the Aryans bring him in as an evil person, but the Phule myth converts the Daitya into a deity, so that his character changes completely, and therefore the role that he is playing also changes. And then it becomes a myth where not only is the evil one converted into a good one, but it's a myth of morality, because those that were associated with goodness earlier behave in a terribly immoral, evil manner. They deceive Bali, and he has to undergo this problem. So I think that is again a myth which is not just, the heroes of the Aryans were turned into the devils and the devils of the Aryans became the heroes, which incidentally is not the first time this happened, because this happened also in the relationship between the Indo-Aryans and the old Iranian Aryans, where the Iranians, people like the gods, the devas, were really the Daityas of the Rigveda, and they reversed the roles of people like Indra and so on. But I thought that the myth of Bali has many dimensions, both of the story dimension and the reversal of the story, as well as the value system of righteousness and morality that is associated with the story. I think that's all I have to say.